Hey folks, I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast, theendofhistory.net, and we are continuing in our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story, in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of America's independence. And we are continuing today in the story. Today's episode, we're going to be looking at the age of settlement, specifically the French and Spanish settlements in North America and how that started to unfold during this period. It's really important, though, as we jump into today's episode, to kind of have a perspective of what it was like for the Europeans in the era that immediately followed Columbus's discovery of the New World. And I would just encourage you, kind of imagine what that would be like. Like, they didn't know that a whole other half of the world existed. There were other people groups. There were other civilizations that they didn't know existed before. And in my mind, it kind of fits the scenario if tomorrow you woke up and the United Nations, the President of the United States, whoever announced that we have discovered on the other side of the moon, there's a planet with a whole other civilization, a whole other people group, an alien race. And, what does that mean? There are all kinds of implications for what our questions would be, how it would disorient our perspectives of reality, our perspectives of institutions, of just what the truth was, of everything, really. And so that's the mindset we want to use as we kind of put ourselves in the place of the people of Europe during this time period, immediately following Columbus's discovery and what everything must have looked like, felt like for them during that time. As we jump into today's episode, I do want to encourage you, if you haven't already, go to theendofhistory.net, sign up to be a Patreon supporter, be an End of History insider, where you can get access to all of our past podcast series, podcast episodes. That includes everything from the history of the Middle East, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the history of the European Union, the history of terrorism. We've got a lot out there, and we've been doing this since 2012. You can go to the website, theendofhistory.net, sign up to become a Patreon supporter, an End of History insider for as little as $1 a month. That's available to you out there. And I think that'll do it. Let's go ahead and jump into today's episode, and we're going to begin looking at the age of the settling of North America.
This is the End of History.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So just as it was critical to understand the cultural background to Christopher Columbus and the age of discovery of the New World that we looked at in the last episode, the same is also essential for understanding the beginnings of the age of settlement and the New World. The movements of Spain, of France, and Britain or England toward the newly discovered world make far less sense to us without understanding what was happening in Europe at the time. And central to that story is the story of religion and the Protestant Reformation. All right, so we have to put ourselves in the shoes of, like I said, of a European once the full impact of what Columbus had discovered became known. Columbus thought he had found a new path across the seas to Eastern Asia, and by doing so, he had made the world much smaller, more compact, more connected, but he was wrong. And so as the full weight of his discovery began to be realized, the impact was immense. The world was not made smaller, it was made a lot larger. If anything, the people of Europe felt their universe expand. There were whole lands, people groups that they had never heard of, never imagined were even there before. Were the people like them? Were they different? It had to be as if we were to become suddenly aware that there was a whole race of alien beings on a nearby planet today. Are they like us? Are we like them? The world, the universe would suddenly change, wouldn't it? And one of the biggest shifts was the perspective of religion. When the priests talked about humanity, the Catholic priests, when they talked about humanity and the children of God, were they talking about these Indians and the New World too? How was it that the priests themselves didn't know about the New World? How was it that the Pope, still believed to be infallible at this time, despite the centuries of evidence to the contrary, how was it that the Pope never knew about the New World? What else didn't he know about? What other surprises were out there? So less than 25 years after Columbus's first voyage to the New World, Questions like this gave people the space to begin questioning what they had always assumed to be true, infallible, and unquestionable. And that's when Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation in 1517. So as a result of all these converging currents of change and awakening, the settlement and exploration of the New World after Columbus, it unfolded against the backdrop of one of the most transformative upheavals in European history, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter Reformation, beginning with Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic authority in 1517. That Reformation fractured Western Christianity, reshaping politics, reshaping identity, and imperial ambition across Europe. Most of the listeners are probably familiar with the Protestant Reformation, maybe a little less with the Catholic Counter Reformation. The Counter Reformation was an acknowledgement within Catholicism of the corruption that had been allowed to fester within the Catholic Church. But they maintained, those who held on to Catholicism, they maintained that the Catholic traditions, the doctrines, were still the truth. The Church could be reformed internally without having to give way to heresy. And that's exactly what the Counter-Reformers and the Catholic Church saw when they looked at Martin Luther and his Protestant successors. These two sides were adamantly opposed to one another, even to the point of death, to martyrdom and murder. In his book, Before the Revolution, the historian Daniel Richter, he writes, "For the better part of a century, on the continent of Europe, religious rivals killed each other mercilessly in civil wars, wars among nation-states, and wars not easily put in either category. Many Protestants became convinced that they were in fact living in the end times, that the final cataclysmic struggle between Christ and the Antichrist was unfolding before their eyes, and that every political as well as spiritual effort must be bent to the cause. The Antichrist was none other than the Pope, and his chief agent on this earth was the monarch of Spain. A kind of Protestant conquistador emerged, seeking to combat the Papists with all the fervor of his predecessors had devoted to combating the infidel in their Lord's struggle to bring about a new heaven and a new earth." That's the end of quote. These conflicts didn't remain confined to the old world in Europe. They profoundly influenced the colonization of the Americas, where religious rivalry became a driving force behind exploration, settlement patterns, and intercultural encounters. Spain, enriched by early New World conquest after Columbus, they emerged as the staunch defender of Catholic orthodoxy. As Protestantism spread through Northern Europe, Catholic powers, especially Spain, they saw the Americas as a battleground for spiritual as well as imperial supremacy. So Spanish colonization was explicitly tied to the Counter-Reformation. Missionaries like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, they accompanied conquistadors seeking to convert indigenous people and solidify Catholic influence. And the Spanish crown viewed evangelization as both a divine mandate and a political tool, ensuring loyalty to Catholic monarchs and resisting Protestant encroachment. Meanwhile, on the other side, Protestant nations, England, the Netherlands, parts of France, they entered the race for empire, partly to challenge Spain's religious and geopolitical dominance. So the Protestant Reformation had weakened internal unity in those countries, but it also created new motivations for overseas expansions. Many groups like the Puritans, the Huguenots, those various dissenting sects, they sought refuge from persecution and envisioned the New World as a place to build godly societies free from the constraints of European state churches. Less than half a century after Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, the European continent began to drift into a long era of religious wars between the two sides, Catholic versus Protestant. The European Wars of Religion, stretching from the French Wars of Religion to the 30 Years' War, in many instances intensified the desire among individual groups to seek stability, to seek a relief from this persecution abroad, outside of Europe. And these conflicts drained resources, delayed colonization efforts, and shaped the ideological tone of the settlements once they took place. For example, the French Huguenots, these were like French Protestants, okay? And they faced intense persecution from their Catholic majority, the Catholic state there in France, and it led to thousands of these guys fleeing France, principally to England, the Netherlands, Germany, South Africa, and, of course, America. The French Huguenots, attempted early colonies in Florida and Brazil explicitly as Protestant alternatives to the Catholic Empire. Their destruction by Spanish forces underscored how religious rivalry shaped colonial violence. In English North America, the imprint of Europe's religious turmoil was unmistakable. Puritans in New England built communities grounded in covenant theology. They saw themselves as a chosen people fleeing the corruption of the Anglican Church, not just the Catholic Church, but even the English version of Protestantism, which they viewed as corrupt. Quakers, Baptists, and other Protestant religious minorities and dissenters established colonies such as Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, where religious liberty really became a defining principle. These settlements reflected the fragmentation of Protestant Europe and the search for new models of religious coexistence. In other words, by that point, it wasn't just Catholic versus Protestant. It was Protestant versus more extreme Protestants in an effort by these believers to find the true faith and live it out in their daily lives. The Counter Reformation also shaped French colonization. Jesuit missionaries in New France, which is what the French called their claimed holdings in the New World, they forged deep alliances with indigenous Indian nations, blending evangelization and diplomacy. Their efforts contrasted sharply with the more rigid Spanish mission system, but both reflected Catholic Europe's determination to reclaim spiritual authority in the New World. Now, I suppose we can go ahead and pick up where we left off in the last episode and look at Spain's settlement efforts in the New World, not just South America, but in North America, in what would become the United States of America. Spanish exploration and settlement of North America unfolded as a centuries-long saga of ambition, faith, violence, and endurance. Between Columbus's voyages and the American Revolution, Spain carved out a vast but often fragile presence across what is now the United States. Their story wasn't simply one of empires and maps. It's also the story of individuals, of soldiers, of priests, settlers, and indigenous allies whose lives shaped the borderlands of a continent. Spain's North American story begins with Juan Ponce de Leon, who in 1513 sailed north from Puerto Rico and claimed the peninsula he named Pascua Florida, or Feast of Flowers, for the Spanish crown. And Ponce de Leon was a veteran of Columbus's second voyage to the Americas, and he described the region of his exploration in Florida as no man's land, abandoned, ripe for the taking. But the reality is, Florida was home to some 350,000 Indians by the time Ponce de Leon arrived there. He failed to establish a permanent colony, but his landing marked the beginning of Spain's long struggle to control that region. And so by the mid-1500s, Spain viewed Florida as essential, not just for its wealth, but its strategic position, because from there they could guard the sea lanes between Havana and Spain. French Protestants briefly established Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville, Florida in 1562. They threatened Spanish claims there. So in response, this guy, Pedro Menendez de Avillas, he launched a brutal assault in 1565, killing most of those colonists, destroying their fort. This wasn't the first, and it sure wouldn't be the last Catholic and Protestant violent confrontation in the New World. That same year, Avillas founded St. Augustine, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the U.S. St. Augustine originated almost half a century before the more famous British colony of Jamestown in Virginia that we'll talk about in the next episode. Life in St. Augustine was harsh. Hurricanes battered the coast. Supplies were scarce. Indigenous resistance was constant. And yet the families there, the settlers there, they persisted. Soldiers married local women. African freedmen joined the community. Franciscan friars built missions stretching north towards Georgia. These missions became cultural crossroads, places where Timucua, Guale, and Apalachee peoples negotiated, resisted, and adapted to Spanish rules. And one of the most incredible, if you're looking at the story of the Spanish settlement of the New World, one of the most incredible stories of Spanish efforts to explore and settle Florida is the story of Cabeza de Vaca and the Narvaez expedition. The Narvaez expedition was built upon a vision to carve a new empire from the wild edges of Florida. So 600 men sailed with dreams of gold, but in the end, only 4 of these guys would live to tell the tale. And among them was Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. Now, the expedition just started off with disaster. They boarded their ships, and the ships were shattered in storms. Their horses drowned in the surf. Their rafts splintered on the unforgiving Gulf Coast. And by the time Cabeza de Vaca staggered ashore near present-day Galveston, Texas in 1528, he wasn't a conqueror. He was just a survivor, one of just a handful of men from an army that had vanished, just been eaten up by the sea. And so they were enslaved by local Indian tribes. And as slaves, they learned to endure hunger, cold, grief. And yet in that crucible, something began to change. This guy, De Vaca, he became a trader, a healer, a wanderer who crossed the continent not with steel, but with open hands. He learned languages, listened to stories. He walked beside the people of the land. They called him a child of the sun, is what the Indians called him at the time, a man whose touch could drive out sickness, so they believe. And so he traveled across the lands we now know as Texas, through the deserts of the Southwest, over the vast plains, guided not by maps, but by human kindness and this will to survive. Just a fascinating story. For 8 years, Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions moved from village to village among these Indian tribes, gathering followers who believed that they had been touched by the divine. When they finally reached Spanish outpost in Mexico in 1536, the soldiers at that outpost, they just stared at these guys walking up, stared at them in disbelief. These weren't conquistadors. They were pilgrims returned from the dead in their mind. Cabeza de Vaca would later write a book called La Relation, the first great survival narrative of North America, a testament to endurance, humility, and the unexpected transformation of a man who set out to conquer a continent and instead learned to walk in it as a brother. He became a proponent of Indian rights and an early abolitionist who denounced Spanish slavery systems within the New World. While Florida anchored Spain's eastern frontier, the Southwest drew explorers chasing rumors of wealth. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led one of the most ambitious expeditions in North American histories. He was inspired by the tale of the 7 cities of Pueblo. Coronado marched north from Mexico with hundreds of soldiers, indigenous allies, and livestock. The expedition reached the Zuni Pueblos, stone towns shimmering in the desert light, but they found no gold. Right? This is a story we've heard before. They found no gold. Still, Coronado pressed on. His men became the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon. Now, I always imagine what it must have been like to come up. If you've ever seen the Grand Canyon in real life, it is just a sight that kind of takes your breath away. It's just an awesome sight. And I have always wondered, every time I look at it, every time I've seen the Grand Canyon, what would it have been like the first people to see that, first Indians to see that, the first Spanish conquistadors like Coronado here to see that. He's pressed on. He crossed the Great Plains, marveling at the endless grasslands, the herds of bison that surrounded a man like the sea, as his chronicler Pedro de Castaneda wrote. Coronado's journey ended in disappointment, but it opened the interior of North America to Spanish imagination. The Great Plains, once a blank space on European maps, now began to hold shape. It began to hold stories. It began to have a strategic value. And so by the late 1500s, Spain turned from exploration to settlement. In 1598, Juan de Anati led hundreds of settlers, soldiers, priests along the Rio Grande River, establishing the colony of New Mexico. And they founded towns, they built missions, they imposed the encomienda system, which demanded labor and tribute from Pueblo communities. The encomienda system was a Spanish colonial labor system in the Americas that granted conquistadors control over the Indians, over the indigenous populations, compelling them to provide tribute, like labor, gold, crops, in exchange for supposed protection and Christian teaching. But it quickly devolved into forced labor, into slavery, and it became synonymous with Spanish exploitation. Life on the Spanish frontier in the New World was precarious at best. Water was scarce. If you've ever been to the Southwest, that makes sense, right? Water was scarce. Apache raids were frequent, and Spanish authority was really pretty thin. But the colony endured, shaped by the resilience of both settlers and indigenous peoples. Pueblo farmers continued ancient agricultural traditions while navigating the pressures of Spanish rule. Spanish rule in New Mexico grew increasingly oppressive for these Indians. Soldiers and governors enforced harsh tribute demands. They seized food during droughts. They punished resistance with imprisonment, whipping, enslavement. Franciscan missionaries destroyed kivas, masks, and sacred objects, banning Pueblo ceremonies, and executing or mutilating spiritual leaders who defied them. Atrocities like the Acoma Massacre of 1599, where hundreds were killed and survivors were enslaved or maimed, they became seared into the Pueblo's communal memory. By 1680, religious persecution, forced labor, and relentless brutality had finally pushed the Pueblo world to the breaking point. And those tensions erupted that year in 1680 when the Pueblo revolt, one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history, drove the Spanish out, at least for a short time. Now, you probably don't hear much about this one in most of our school history books, but this revolt, birthed out of Spanish oppression of the Pueblo Indians, was, like I said, one of the most successful uprisings against European colonial powers in North American history. That included the iconic stories of the 19th century like Little Bighorn and others that would eventually fall into this narrative. It unfolded just before dawn on August 10, 1680. Survivors recalled how the desert air around the Rio Grande felt charged as if the land itself were holding its breath. In the kivas are a sacred, typically subterranean circular room used by the Pueblo people for religious ceremonies, community meetings, and ceremonial gatherings, social gatherings. In these kivas of the northern Pueblos, runners whispered the final messages of Pope, the medicine man who had spent years weaving together a fragile alliance of Pueblo Indians, Pueblo peoples. After decades of forced labor, the burning of sacred kivas, the whipping, the executions of spiritual leaders, the time for silence in the face of the Spanish was going to come to an end that morning. So as the sun rose, drums echoed across the mesas, and Pueblo warriors surged into Spanish settlements, their faces streaked with clay and ash. In Santa Fe, Governor Antonio de Otoman, he awoke to chaos. Smoke rising from the mission churches, shouts of revolt, and the realization that the Pueblos had coordinated an uprising across hundreds of miles. By nightfall, 400 Spaniards, including 21 Franciscan friars, lay dead across the land. For the first time in more than a century, the Pueblo world actually breathed in freedom. Families washed away their baptismal names, their Christian names in the rivers, reopened sealed kivas, and restored ceremonies long forbidden by the Spanish. The Spanish, on their part, fled south, leaving behind a land reclaimed, if only for a little while, by the people who had shaped it for generations. When they eventually returned, more than a decade later, I think the Spanish returned after 12 years, they adopted a more negotiated form of governance, allowing the Pueblo religious practices to coexist with Catholicism. Spain's North American empire was constantly shaped by rivalry with other European powers. When the French established Louisiana in 1682, Spain feared they would be encircled by the French. So in response, they founded missions and presidios across Texas. That included places like San Antonio, founded in 1718. These settlements were small, clusters of adobe buildings, soldiers' barracks, and mission churches, but they served as Spain's defensive shield. Friars taught Christianity and European farming, while soldiers patrolled vast distances to deter French traders and indigenous raiders. By the mid-1700s, Spain faced a new threat. Russian fur traders were moving south along the Pacific coast to secure the region in that part of the world. The Crown launched the California mission system, the Spanish Crown did. In 1769, they established San Diego, followed by missions at Monterey, San Antonio, and San Gabriel. California's missions became some of the most influential Spanish institutions in North America. Local Indian tribes and cultures were drawn into mission life through this mix of persuasion, coercion, and force that the Spanish had adopted by then. The missions reshaped landscapes, economies, and cultures. And to this day, when you drive through there, if you go through this area of the country, you'll still see remnants, the legacy of the Spanish settlements that were established hundreds of years ago. Spanish North America was not a monolithic empire, but a mosaic of frontier societies. By the 1700s, mestizo families, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, they dominated trade networks across New Mexico and Texas. They carried goods along the Camino Real, linking Santa Fe to Mexico City, and served as a cultural intermediaries in a diverse frontier world. A new society, a new civilization was taking effect here. this merging of civilizations had given birth to a new civilization. By the time of the American Revolution, Spain's North American empire was vast, but it was thinly populated. St. Augustine, Santa Fe, San Antonio, the California missions, they formed a chain of settlements stretching for thousands of miles, but each one depended on fragile alliances, limited resources, and distant royal support. Still, Spain's presence profoundly shaped the continent. They introduced horses, cattle, irrigation systems, and new forms of architecture. They mapped rivers, mountains, and plains, and they left behind a cultural legacy, visible in the place names, the languages, the foods, the traditions, that remains woven into the fabric of the modern United States to this day. Hey folks, I'm J.B. Shreve, and if you've followed this podcast, this blog, for any length of time, you know that one of the things I love is a deep dive into truth and to Scripture. I love to find application for my life in the here and now. Well, that's what my latest book represents. It's titled David, Poet, Warrior, King, and it's a deep dive into the biblical account of King David's life. If you think you know the story already, you might want to check again. This is more than the giant killer, more than the king, more than the guy who sinned with Bathsheba. This is a biblically based, factual account of the legend King David that towers over Scripture really like no one else does. This is one of the most enjoyable books I've written so far. What we do, we track David's origins, the early years in the fields, and ask questions that most people either ignore or miss when it comes to his family. We look at his life as an outlaw on the run from King Saul. We go into the kingdom years and how things actually began to fall apart after his moral failing. And in the background of all of these epic stories is the big question: why did God like this guy so much? If you haven't read the book yet, I want to encourage you, go get your copy today. You can find the links at the website, theendofhistory.net, or just go to Amazon and put it in your shopping cart today. David, Poet, Warrior, King by J.B. Shreve. This book was written for those who love studying Scripture, who want to go deeper, but also for those just discovering God's truth. David, Poet, Warrior, King. It'll leave a mark on your soul when you're finished reading it. As we jump into New France, or the French areas of exploration and settlement in North America, you're going to have to forgive me just a little bit. I don't speak French. I can't even mimic French very well, but I'm going to do my best to get some of the names, the locations, the individual names right as best I can. But when it came to French exploration and settlement in North America, one key defining characteristic is that, and this contrasts it from like English settlements as well as from the Spanish, French settlement unfolded along the rivers. It unfolded along waterways that became the arteries of an empire stretching from the icy Gulf of St. Lawrence in eastern Canada to the warm delta of the Mississippi River. Between the first tentative voyages of the 1520s, the rising tensions that preceded the French and Indian Wars that began in 1754, France ended up carving out a sprawling, loosely populated, but sprawling and deeply interconnected world that they came to call New France. Now, the New France story is one of explorers, missionaries, traders, and importantly, Indian allies whose lives shaped the continent in ways still visible again today. French exploration began under King Francis I, who desired both wealth and a western route to Asia. In 1524, he sent Giovanni de Verrazano to chart the Atlantic coast from Florida to Newfoundland. Verrazano sailed into what is now New York Harbor. He anchored near the Narrows and marveled at the wooded shores that sheltered the bay there. He imagined the land between Spanish Florida and English Newfoundland as a potential French domain and named it Francesca and Nova Gallia. A decade later, Jacques Cartier, he pushed deeper inland. Between 1534 and 1541, he explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the river that would become the backbone of New France. Cartier planted a cross on the Gaspé Peninsula, claiming the region for France, and wintered near modern Quebec. Though he exaggerated the tales of mineral wealth and failed to establish a permanent colony, Cartier's voyages opened the interior of North America to French ambition. But the true founder of French North America was this guy, Samuel de Champlain, a soldier, cartographer, and diplomat, really whose life, if you ever want to read a good biography, go find a biography on de Champlain. His life reads like an epic. He was born on the storm-lashed Atlantic coast of France around 1567 in the seaport of Bruges, a place where salt, ships, and the smell of tar shaped a boy destined for oceans. Little survives of his childhood, but he later wrote that he felt a love of the high seas from his early years. That love became his compass, his orientation for life. As a young man, Champlain, he fought in the wars of King Henry IV, learning discipline, strategy, and the hard mathematics of survival in that fighting. When peace came, he turned again to the sea, sailing with his uncle to the Caribbean and to Mexico. And it was there that he honed the skills that would define him: precise observation, map-making, and a restless hunger to understand the world around him. In 1603, he crossed the Atlantic to the St. Lawrence River, and he beginning a lifelong bond there with the vast northern wilderness. He returned again and again. Between 21 and 29 voyages in all, he charted coasts, rivers, and lakes with a cartographer's eye and a poet's patience. In 1608, he founded Quebec, carving a foothold for France into the cliffs above the river and the earning of his title, Father of New France. Champlain was more than an explorer. He was a diplomat. He forged alliances with the Innu, the Algonquin, the Wendat peoples, sharing their battles, sharing their fires, and recording their cultures with unusual respect, especially for this era. He fought the Iroquois, one of the most powerful Indian nations by this point and in this region of the world. He survived winters that killed half his men and governed a fragile colony that depended on his stubborn will to survive. Now, he died on Christmas Day in 1635 in Quebec, the city he had dreamed into being. He left behind maps, journals, and a legacy etched across the rivers and lakes of a continent. Now, one of the key differences between the French and the Spanish, and to some degree between the French and the British, involved how they handled the Indians that surrounded their explorations and their settlement efforts. For the most part, the French were often far more engaged with the Indians as allies and as trading partners than as subjects and slaves. One of the reasons for this is that the French simply didn't expend the same military resources into the New World as either the Spanish or the English did. For example, Champlain's world of canoes and forests and fragile diplomacy, that's the way it worked for him. He traveled with the indigenous guys. He slept under the northern stars. He recorded the landscapes with this precision that was really rare for his time. In 1609, he joined his Huron and Algonquin allies in battle against the Iroquois, like I mentioned, firing his arquebus and shocking warriors who had never seen such a weapon. Now, an arquebus was an early shoulder-fired firearm from the 15th to 17th centuries. It was a precursor of the musket, really, characterized by its matchlock ignition system, making it one of the first portable, mechanically fired guns that was easier to use than like hand cannons, and a major step forward in military firearms. Well, Champlain was not the first European to impress the Indians with this weapon, and he wouldn't be the last before they started getting hold of him themselves. Unlike the Spanish or the English, the French didn't send large numbers of settlers. By 1640, there were fewer than 400 colonists who lived in New France. The French crown actually discouraged immigration. They feared that they would lose population at home, and rumors spread that Canada was this frozen wasteland for them. So as a result, French colonization really took on this very distinctive form. You had fur traders who ranged deep into the interior, living among the indigenous nations. You had Jesuit missionaries, again Catholics, traveling by canoe to remote villages, learning languages, and recording detailed ethnographies. Soldiers and farmers clustered around Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal. This sparse population meant that French power depended not on a mass of their own people or military armies. It depended on these alliances, not domination. Trade, intermarriage, diplomacy, that bound French and indigenous communities together in this complex web of relationships. By the late 1600s, French explorers pushed west, they pushed south, seeking new trade routes and strategic footholds. Their journeys created a vast continental network stretching thousands of miles. French traders and missionaries. They established posts at Detroit, at Green Bay, at St. Ignace, at Sault Ste. Marie. And these settlements became multicultural hubs where French, Huron, Potawatomi, and other nations exchanged goods, stories, and kinship ties. And that multiculturalism really shaped the tone of the future settlements that would move into these areas or that would grow out of these areas quite differently from what was established among the Spanish settlements or the British settlements that we'll see in the next episode. In the 1670s, Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette, they paddled down the Mississippi River, confirming it flowed into the Gulf of Mexico. A decade later, René Robert Cavelier, Sue de la Salle, they followed the river to its mouth and claimed the entire basin, millions of square miles, as Louisiana for King Louis the 14th. This claim linked Canada to the Gulf Coast through a chain of rivers, forts, and alliances. It also established a western wall to the British settlements that were beginning to be built on the eastern seaboard at that time. New France was an empire built on not on cities, but on waterways and on relationships. French settlement continued to expand throughout the early 1700s. They founded Mobile, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi, Baton Rouge, New Orleans. These towns were human, diverse, strategically vital areas. New Orleans, founded in 1718, became the jewel of the lower Mississippi, a port city of French officials, enslaved Africans, free people of color, and indigenous traders. And by the mid-1700s, French North America stretched from the St. Lawrence to the Gulf of Mexico, yet it remained thinly populated and dependent on those indigenous alliances. Meanwhile, British colonies along the Atlantic coast began to swell, with settlers starting to push westward, which set up for a confrontation between the British and the French. The two empires would eventually face off in the Ohio Valley, where French forts and the British land claims overlapped. Tensions escalated, and it set the stage for the French and Indian War in the mid-18th century. That's where people like George Washington would begin to gain fame. Benjamin Franklin, we'd start to hear about him there. But that story is still to come, though. For now, and in the next episode, I want to turn our attention to English settlement in the New World, to North America. This is a story you're going to be familiar with, at least a little bit. It's the story of the Pilgrims. Now, hopefully, if I do this right, we can explore this story with fresh eyes. I hope you'll check it out, as I felt in my research that I personally discovered the early Pilgrims, the English settlers, the Pilgrims, in a way I had not seen them before. They were idealists. They were pioneers. They were men and women of really strong conviction and faith. And honestly, I felt I discovered some of my own spiritual ancestors in these folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, and you're listening to the End of History podcast, and that story is coming in the next episode in our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.